welcome to the Gulf International Forum discussion today on Biden, Iran, and the JCPOA, a race to save democracy. This, I need tell no one that this has been one of the more interesting presidential campaigns, one of the more interesting years that has really upended what we all considered normal. Having said that, we now have a new. We will shortly have a new president, and he has announced that he wishes to approach diplomacy in the Gulf in a more traditional fashion than what we've had until now, and beginning by restarting the JCPOA, the Joint Commission. For the agreement to restore the treaty, the agreement to. Boy, I'm really messing up today with this thing. My apologies. The agreement with Iran to limit its production and stockpiling of nuclear material. We have another 15 days to go until the presidency starts, and for many of us, this is an issue we had long expected. Many of us had expected, myself included, that there would be an October surprise and then a November surprise, and perhaps even a December surprise, as the outgoing administration would lay landmines behind it to make the work of the Biden administration impossible. We are now 10 days short, and I'm crossing my fingers that this is as far as it is going to go, that we do not have another surprise in store for the last 10 days or 15 days of the administration. We have with us three distinguished speakers. One is still having, apparently Dr. Albert Wolf is having a technical problem linking on, but in order of their appearance, our speakers are Dr. Mohsen Milani, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and Professor of Politics at the University of South Florida. I won't go into his, you can all access his biography on our website and in the announcement, but he has written extensively on Iran and the Ayatollah's game plan, several books, has attended quite literally more than 100 conferences across the globe. Dr. Liora Hendelman-Baavur is the director of the Alliance for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. In addition to her position as the director, she has been writing on Iran for a number of years. And Dr. Wolf is an associate fellow at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, professor of political science at the American University of Iraq, Baghdad, and has spent considerable time abroad with American educational institutions in the Middle East and South Asia. So just to get the program started, I don't want to delay this very much. I would like to invite Dr. Mohsen Milani to speak on what does Tehran expect from Joe Biden? Will Iran's domestic issues influence Biden's foreign policy? What are the divisions between Iranian politicians, and how will the elections of the next 6 months affect Iran's approach to restoring the JCPOA?
Thank you. Do I start?
Yes, please. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to express my appreciation to Gulf International Forum for organizing this panel. And it is an honor to be on the panel with distinguished colleagues. I've been given about 8 to 10 minutes to address those issues, so I'll do my best to follow the instruction and end my comment exactly as I was asked to end it. Regarding the first question, what Iran expects from the incoming Biden administration. First of all, there is something called public opinion in Iran. And because of the importance public opinion plays in domestic as well as foreign policy, it is important for us to distinguish between what Iranian politicians say publicly and what they do privately or behind closed doors. What I'm going to tell you is what I think is the prevalent position in Iran, sort of a consensus among different factions in Iran. Most of the experts in Iran and most of the people in different factions believe that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was a good deal. It wasn't a perfect deal. And Iran didn't get everything it wanted, nor did the US. And their argument is that that is what negotiation is all about. You give some, you take some. And therefore, they believe the US made an illegal decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, and then, in addition to that, imposing crippling sanctions on Iran, which everyone knows in Iran has devastated Iranian economy. They also believe that the US, and to some extent the Europeans and Russians and Chinese to a much lesser extent, did not implement their obligations under the JCPOA. That is why Iran has decided recently to, for example, increase the number of centrifuges they have and began enriching uranium at 20%. Essentially, what they want is America's unconditional return to the JCPOA, the removal of the sanctions, and no negotiations about the JCPOA. They think that Iran and 6 global powers spent over 3 years of negotiations. And if we want to have further negotiations about other issues, the position Tehran has taken so far is that let's first implement the JCPOA, and then we can talk about other important issues, such as Iran's missile program and Iran's regional activities from Syria to Lebanon to Yemen to Afghanistan and definitely Iraq. So that is essentially the fundamental position that Iran has. Unconditional return of the Joe Biden administration to JCPOA, implementation of all its provisions, and of course, Iran is going to reverse the decisions it had made about its nuclear program. In other words, we will all go back to the day before the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA. And then once we build confidence, we can move on and discuss other issues. The second issue, which is really connected to the first, is the question of different factions, specifically hardliners versus moderates in Iran. Do they have different positions regarding JCPOA and generally the United States of America? And the answer is yes. There are really key differences between these two because they represent two different paradigms, two different outlooks regarding Iran's position in the region and Iran's position in the global economy. The hardliners essentially have come to the conclusion, they always believed it, but now it is more confirmed for them, that you cannot trust the US. And they have 3 important issues they continuously point out to say why you cannot trust the US. Number one, they say US unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, from the Iran nuclear deal. Second one, they point out that the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian general in Iraq, was violation of international law, and therefore they say we cannot trust the US. And finally, the targeted assassination of an Iranian scientist, Mr. Fakhrizadeh, a few weeks ago in Tehran, has increased their suspicions that the operation was done by Israel with the help, or at least a tacit agreement of Washington. And therefore, their conclusion is that you cannot trust the US anymore. Furthermore, they point out, imagine that we do reach an agreement with the US about nuclear deal or about other deals. What guarantee do we have that 4 years from now or 8 years from now, we do not have another Donald Trump coming and tearing apart the agreement we've had with them? Therefore, and here is the key point, therefore, their idea is that we might be willing to have an agreement about our nuclear program with the US based on JCPOA, but we do not want to expand our relationship with the US, and that we need to make two important strategic decisions in Iran and implement them. Number one, self-sufficiency in terms of Iran's economy, so that Iran is never again under pressure of US unilateral sanctions. And secondly, much more importantly, is that it is time for Iran to pivot toward the East, toward China and Russia. In other words, they want to design Iranian foreign policy based not so much on cooperation with the West, which is something that I believe in, but more in terms of cooperation with China and Russia, so that there would be less pressure from the West and specifically from the United States of America. The moderates, on the other hand, do not share that. Yes, they think that America has to do some confidence building, that somehow mutual trust must be restored between Iran and the United States, but they don't look at America as a structurally to be an enemy of the Islamic Republic, and that Iranian national interests are incompatible with the US national interests. In fact, they believe that in the long run, it is in Iranian national interest not to pivot toward the East, but keep its good relationship with the West, as well as its good relationship with the East. And therefore, not only they are willing to negotiate with the US about restoration of the JCPOA, I believe they are much more willing to discuss Iran's regional activities, regional policy, and to a lesser degree about Iran's missile program. It is very important to mention that when it comes to missile program, Iran's missile program, it is very different than Iran's nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program was never the foundation of Iran's defense posture. It never was. Yes, they were trying to make advances. Some people believe they were trying to make the bomb, but it was not an essential component or the logic behind Iran's defense doctrine. However, Iranian missile technology has been, since the middle of 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq war, the foundation, the very essence of Iran's defense posture. And it would be much more difficult to come to an agreement with Iran about its missile program, I believe, than it was about reaching an agreement with Iran about its nuclear program. And if you really look at the US-Iran relations in the past 42 years, you see that the nuclear issue has been an important issue only in the past 15 years. For the rest of it, for the past 40 years, it has been Iranian competition, geostrategic competition with the US in the region, and Iran's willingness or Iran's plan to develop deterrence and retaliatory capability against the US and against Israel in the region, that has been the core reason why the two countries have been engaged in a Cold War. So I think if we are thinking about negotiating with Iran, it would be much easier to start where there might be some flexibility on the part of Iran, and not to start it with the question of Iran's missile technology. Thank you very much.
I failed to unmute. Now that is terribly, terribly bad on my part. Dr. Milani, I have a question to ask. One of the issues that from time to time appears in the American press and the Western press is that if the elections go sideways in Iran in the future, that there are Iranians who do not want to renew the JCPOA. Is there any significant faction that, in fact, does not want to get the United States back on the JCPOA in Iran's body politics today?
I think there are some elements within the hardliner faction that might not want to have an agreement, but I don't think they are in a position to decide Iran's grand strategy, and definitely not about Iran's nuclear program. That decision is made ultimately by Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, with direct advice from the Revolutionary Guards, and of course, consultation with other major players in Iranian foreign policy establishment. And I don't think those elements that you're talking about at this time have the upper hand. However, what makes them much more attractive to the Western media is because they have the loudest voice. As you know, everywhere, even in this country, when you are loud and when you are you're not shy to express your radical ideas, it attracts attention. But if you look at the performance of Iran, and if you look at the overall philosophy of Ayatollah Khamenei, who really is behind who's the ultimate decision maker about Iran's nuclear program, those voices are marginal voices, and occasionally they become louder when it is in the interest of the Islamic Republic as a whole to showcase them, so that the Western powers recognize that Iran does not have a free hand, and there is a limit to how much concession they can grant the West.
Thank you. Dr. Liora Hendelman, if I could ask you to proceed. Israel has been characterized as the country that is most concerned about the United States returning to the JCPOA. Prime Minister Netanyahu made a few statements the other day indicating that he sees Iran as an existential threat that is determined to obtain a nuclear weapon. But in the meantime, Israel has also, one can say, has benefited from the idea that the U.S. might return to the JCPOA, considering its normalization with the UAE and Bahrain. And so, how do you think Israel will see what Biden is doing? How do you believe that Israel will try to affect what Biden is doing? And is there any bright spot for the Israelis in the event of the United States rejoining the JCPOA? You haven't. You did the same mistake as I did. You did not unmute.
Unmute myself. Okay. First of all, I would like to open and thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this distinguished forum. I was asked to address how would the recent normalization between the two JCC states and Israel impact Biden's foreign policy towards Iran generally and rejoining the JCPOA particularly. So I will try and maneuver between these questions and some of the issues that you've raised, and we will be able to expand on that in the Q&A, of course. So first, I would have to say that any attempt to try to answer this question is bound to be highly complicated, and I apologize in advance if I repeat some of the details that were already mentioned by Professor Milani. There is an anticipation among some, anxiety among others in the region, that the administration of President-elect Joe Biden, staffed with Obama-era officials, will get right back on the tracks of negotiations with Iran. There is also a speculation assessment that Biden's incoming administration may have a much more conservative approach to the Middle East when compared to the relative free hand that the Trump administration offered on many issues, which in turn prepared the ground for the Abraham Accords. It is important to note and remember that despite the narrative of peace and or normalization around the Abraham Accords, a crucial motivation for their formation is deterrence, both political and military, against Iran. I remember a conference in the summer of 2015 during the finalization of the JCPOA in Vienna, when one of the speakers said that the post-Arab Spring circumstances in the Middle East are not so much a result of how strong Iran has become in the region, but more related to the weakness demonstrated by the Arab world. As 2020 came to an end, the Abraham Accords brought into the open years of secretive Arab-Israeli talks of cooperation, which got further boost as Morocco announced in December it would establish formal diplomatic ties with Israel, joining the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. And there are rumors additional Arab states might join the new normalization caravan in the Middle East. Now, even before they were signed in September at the White House, Biden, from his campaign trail, praised the Abraham Accords. He welcomed the steps taken by the UAE and Bahrain to normalize ties with Israel, and also indicated that a Biden-Harris administration will build on these steps. Taken this pro-election declaration, it is highly likely that the next president would work to leverage these growing ties and build upon these foreign policy achievements of the Trump administration, along with yesterday's reports of a U.S. broker deal to ease the 3 years dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. However, the next few years will not only be about these dynamics, but also about how Iran navigates its own polity. With the upcoming elections in the Islamic Republic scheduled for June 2021, familiar divisions have already surfaced. There seems to be an intense debate, perhaps even instrumental debate, in the Iranian political systems about returning to negotiations with the United States. On the one hand, Iranian principalists or hardliners, as they are most often called, expressed the opinion that the US cannot be trusted and that Iran's economic crisis will be resolved through resistance economy. They further claim there is no difference between the Republican and Democratic parties in their hostility towards Iran. Therefore, it is not important whether the presidency is occupied by Trump or by Biden. This kind of statements are occasionally voiced by the country's senior officials, from the supreme spiritual leader Ali Khamenei to junior supporters of the regime like Qasem Soleimani's outspoken daughter, Zainab. Despite the familiar notions of its hostility towards Israel and the West and the US, and contrary to claims that the nature of the current Iranian regime is not going to change based on what people voted for in the US, the pragmatist or reformist camp led by President Rouhani and voiced mostly by Foreign Minister Zarif support, at least in principle, a renewed dialogue with Washington. They are promoting the idea that the Trump's presidency was a mere temporary setbacks or deviation from the agreement that can be revived, and accordingly, Biden's victory withholds a real opportunity to lift the sanctions on Iran and improve the situation of Iranian people. Against this familiar backdrop, various statements by senior Iranian officials following the US elections have conveyed messages regarding their conditions for a possible resumption of negotiations, with the main point being that the US will have to prove a quid pro quo for Iran's agreement to resume negotiations. With this in mind, however, the Abraham Accords should be seen as part of a wide geostrategic environment that is different from 4, 5, or 6 years ago. On the one hand, there is an obvious sense of urgency in Iran in view of the acute economic crisis and a desire to lead to an immediate improvement in the economic situation, all the more so due to the COVID-19 crisis. For the same reasons, and especially in view of the difficult financial situation in the US and the world in general, the Biden administration will have to consider additional obligations while prioritizing the details of the new administration's foreign policy. Biden has already underscored the importance of renewing US alliance with Europe and NATO, following years in which Iran benefited from the split between the Trump administration and US-European allies. Biden administration will also have to cope with the ongoing debate in Washington concerning Iran's advanced missile program. There are also reservations with regard to Iran's policy throughout the Middle East, in particular, Iran's subversive activity and widespread regional entrenchment since 2015. On these particular issues, it appears that the gaps between the United States and Europe are not wide, and this can benefit the US stance towards renewing negotiations. The US relations with China, Russia, North Korea are additional fronts that the Biden administration will have to deal with and may affect the motivations and urgency of Iran, of the Iran nuclear file. According to foreign reports, there seems to be two main approaches in Israel regarding the possibility of resuming dialogue with Iran as the preferred means of halting its progress in the nuclear field. The more moderate stance suggests that Israel should be involved in the efforts of any new administration in the White House and even take part in the process which will lead to the US re-enter negotiations with Iran. They suggest that Israel should seek the means to influence future political moves vis-a-vis Iran based on a clear policy that reflects its imperative interest without negating in principle dialogue with Iran or attempts to reach an agreement with Tehran. The less moderate stance emphasizes that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel, and therefore the new administration in Washington should play out its leverage more firmly. According to this view, Israel should persuade the Biden administration not to concede that sanction leverage at the initial stage in exchange for Iranian willingness to resume negotiations, or even to return to the original nuclear agreement, but to use it towards an extension and improvement of the deal. While there seems to be a European drive to roll back the clock and return to the nuclear agreement from 2015, there are those who advocate the need of striking a new agreement. UN Atomic Watchdog Chief Rafael Grossi was reported saying in an interview last month that there has been too many breaches for the agreement to simply fall back into place. Going back to square one is highly problematic, he emphasized, because it is no longer there. To conclude, there is a fundamental crisis of confidence between the Iranian leadership and the United States, which worsened with the withdrawal of President Trump from the JCPOA, and the two sides will have to overcome that gap. Taking into consideration the short window of opportunity between the entrance of the new president to the White House and the elections for the Iranian presidency in June, it is doubtful whether Iran and the US would be able to reach significant understandings by that time. However, what I can say, and this is for perhaps a window of hope in the horizon, is that, and this I say as a personal experience, and it is as an Israeli citizen, I believe that the Abraham Accords managed to fracture a long-standing conception in Israeli public view that the conflicts in the Middle East, whether it is the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are impossible to resolve. And with the Abraham Accords, we get a sense of the possibilities that can be open and how fast a change can occur. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hendelman. That last comment was perhaps one of the few really optimistic statements I've heard in this discussion in a long time. Attitudes in the end, public opinion counts, whether in a democracy like Israel or, as Dr. Milani said, the dictatorship like Iran. So the idea that that Israelis, because of the Abraham Accords, actually think that what the unthinkable is now thinkable, that it is possible to create relationships with Arab states that are not just cold and formal, like they are with a couple of others. One question did come to mind, however, was that the Abraham Accords are now in agreement with Bahrain and the UAE, two countries that have an intense interest in how the relationship with Iran turns out. And they've demonstrated that no matter how hostile they are, the one red line they do not wish to cross is any possibility of armed hostilities, of war with Iran, because of the damage it would cause them. How do you see the Abraham Accords? I mean, this is not an alliance. This is a normalization of relationships. Will it affect Israeli foreign policy or Israeli policy towards the region? Can the UAE, for example, affect some influence on Israeli foreign policy?
I believe that it already did. Again, for many years, there was a secretive channel between these two countries, but it was never formal. Now we have to take into consideration that along the Israeli-Iranian conflict, the current conflict, which is very recent, I can say 40 years, because if we take another conflict which is more crucial for Israel, and it was not mentioned here because it's not the topic, but it also reflects on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is even more crucial for Israel, and it gives a certain advantages to the Arab states, to the Gulf states, to be more involved openly in and advancing also the resolution or advancement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, it is possible that if there will be an advancement in the Israeli-Palestinian channel, then perhaps maybe in the long run, Iranian hostility will also be able to decrease accordingly, because according to the Islamic Republic's main policy towards Israel, it lifts the Palestinian or pro-Palestinian flag. So perhaps, again, this might be a turning point, or at least the start of a turning point that might affect the entire region in a different way than it did up until this point.
Thank you very much. And finally, Dr. Albert Wolf, as we said, an associate fellow at SAIS with a tremendous history of academia across the Middle East and South Asia. Dr. Wolf, I'd like to ask you, what is the best route to try and diffuse the tension between the U.S. and Iran? What would we here in the United States expect from Biden's presidency? And what role will the other Middle Eastern powers impact Biden? Will he pay attention to people telling him not to negotiate, not to reinstate the JCPOA? Dr. Wolf.
Well, First, I want to thank you, Ambassador, for having me, as well as I want to thank the Gulf International Forum for putting this together. So, first of all, in addition to COVID, Iran is most likely to be President-elect Biden's primary crisis at the outset of his administration. The Biden administration has less to offer and threaten Iran with now than the U.S. did in 2015 or 2018 due to Iran's strengthened ties with Russia and China. It also has a smaller coalition to pressure Iran over its nuclear program. I think that the U.S. should pursue an approach that focuses upon returning to the initial JCPOA and working to extend it, and not adding other dimensions such as ballistic missiles or human rights to a so-called JCPOA plus or JCPOA 2.0. Recently, consistent with Iran's tit-for-tat approach with the Trump administration, it's upping the pressure by raising its level of enrichment to 20%, which is a clear violation of the JCPOA, and seizing a South Korean tanker while the U.S. continues military pressure ahead of the swearing in of the Biden administration. There is the potential of conflict breaking out, either deliberately because Trump wants to make a mark in his final days in office, or in retaliation to mark the one year anniversary of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, either directly by Iran or by a proxy, or through inadvertent escalation, such as an accidental missile launch, a crash, or something along those lines. So it's no secret that there is a long history of U.S.-Iranian mistrust, most recently exacerbated by the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA and the subsequent crisis that began in 2019. So while at first glance it should be simple to put the deal back together again, however, there have been several concerns such as which side should move first. However, something of a consensus has emerged that there should be a return to the original deal rather than trying to create a grand bargain. However, issues such as sanctions removal and Iran returning to compliance are still complicated matters due to issues of sequencing and Iran's political business cycle, given its upcoming presidential election. It's unclear how far and how fast each side can move in less than 6 months. Furthermore, it's unclear how to untangle the thorny questions of which side can or should move first, or whether an approach can be devised whereby both sides can make the first move simultaneously. So the better approach, as I mentioned a moment ago, is to let go of the idea of a grand or grander bargain for the time being. And so we should take into account basically two factors. The first involves proportionality, the degree of reciprocity, and credibility to use force. And second, the vulnerability of the Iranian economy and its political situation. We should, the idea that including items such as ballistic missiles and human rights on the agenda makes it more difficult to obtain a deal. And so Biden and his team were right, in my view, to focus on the original JCPOA for the time being. However, they haven't let go of the idea of a grand bargain or a grander bargain. It's important to note that the U.S. doesn't have the same leverage that it did in 2015 because of Chinese investments in Iran. If you take, for example, investments in the port of Chabahar and Jask, the Biden administration, or the incoming Biden administration, is caught in a box. It's fearful that if it simply signs back up to the JCPOA, it may let go of all the leverage afforded to it by the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy, while simultaneously losing out on a closing window of opportunity. That is the last, say, 6 months of the Rouhani administration and the likely emergence of a hardline administration in Tehran in the coming presidential elections in June. the incoming national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said that any deal with Iran had to have ballistic missiles on the table. And Professor Milani rightfully said that this is something that Iran, that is even more difficult for Iran to negotiate over, because Iran doesn't have much of an air force. This is at the center of their national security. They're not just going to be able to give this up. So, and although that they were included in the initial UN resolution, that ratified the JCPOA, it's highly problematic for getting Iran to give up for a few reasons. It would leave them potentially defenseless because of their quote unquote poor man's air force, as well as the reputational consequences of giving up their ballistic missiles. So such a deal could easily be painted as lacking in proportionality to what the U.S. is willing or able to give up in terms of concessions. If we look at, once the nuclear-related sanctions have been relieved, is the U.S. ready and willing to discuss lifting non-nuclear sanctions? And furthermore, how can the Biden administration get Congress to go along with lifting sanctions related to things such as human rights? Another issue is we need to think about the vulnerability of the Iranian economy and the domestic polity. So the Iranian economy has suffered under the reimposition of the nuclear sanctions, but it has been able to find substitutes. The economic suffering has obviously weakened Rouhani because it's demonstrated that he oversold on the extent to which the JCPOA would revive the economy. Furthermore, it currently looks as if a hardliner backed by the IRGC is most likely to win the upcoming presidential elections. However, it's an open question over whether the winner or whether a hardliner would have a mandate to pull out of any agreement with the Biden administration. One other thing that we need to think about is, just yesterday it was announced that there is an ending of the Gulf states' blockade of Qatar after 3 years. So it's expected that day Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt will lift the blockade of Qatar after 3 years in exchange for Qatar's agreement to seize the lawsuits against the 5 states. Now, this is designed to solidify the containment and isolation of Iran. There are a couple potential problems, though. The blockade of Qatar, along with the Abraham Accords, was arguably partly designed to contain Turkey. Now, the conventional wisdom is that the Abraham Accords was designed to contain Iran, but there's some who argue that the Abraham Accords was motivated to contain Turkey. Although Qatar has not joined the Abraham Accords, it has joined the same pattern of alignment as several of the states that have. This has the potential to drive Turkey and Iran closer to one another, potentially solidifying a Turkey, Russia, Iran, Syria axis of resistance. The Biden administration will have to work to drive a wedge between Turkey and Iran, or find a way to incorporate Turkey into a future Iran deal. Another issue that Dr. Hendelman was just mentioning are some of the issues that exist with Israel. And so, just the other day, Javad Zarif, put out a tweet that warned Trump that Israel would attempt to draw the U.S. into a war with Iran using a so-called false flag, and which Israel was accused of, Israel was accused of planning terrorist attacks against the United States and blaming them on Iran. Zarif warned that such an approach would backfire against the U.S. and Israel. Now, Yuval Steinitz said that this is nonsense, but it's believed that, however, this has raised Israel's state of alert with respect to Iranian proxies, namely Hezbollah. Now, it's important to note that Iran has grown closer to China and Russia over the past 4 years, partly in response to the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy, which has lowered America's economic leverage over Iran, as well as given it fewer partners with which to pressure Iran over the nuclear issue. So those are a few points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much. I think your microphone is off.
Done it again. Okay. One of these days we're going to figure it out right. I did not consult with you ahead of the time, but your comments on Turkey fascinated me because I've been making those same statements to many of my colleagues as well. That the UAE has other items on its agenda rather than just Iran in the normalization with Israel. But I have tended in my career to be a sort of a small picture guy. How do you imagine, particularly Dr. Milani and Dr. Wolf, how do you imagine the actual negotiations will kick off? How do you actually get the two sides to start talking about the nitty gritty of how do we undo the sanctions? How do they walk back their nuclear program, the expanded nuclear program? Whichever one would like to go first.
I'll defer to Dr. Milani. Yeah.
I could not hear the second part of your question. How do they start the negotiation?
What vehicle? What is the vehicle for negotiating? It's one thing to talk about phased reductions, returns, and so forth. But how exactly are they going to do this? Do you think? Are they going to call another grand P5+1 conference? Do we see something more direct between the two? How do you see it unfolding?
I think one possible scenario is that the Europeans, with support from China and Russia, would call for a meeting and invite the U.S. back to JCPOA as one of the original signatories of the agreement. And then from there on, I think Iran and the U.S. can start negotiations. One of the issues that Ayatollah Khamenei has emphasized is that Iran is not interested in direct negotiation with the U.S., even about the nuclear issue, because they think that JCPOA was a multilateral agreement, and therefore the only viable vehicle, the only viable route to restore it is for the U.S. to get back into the agreement. And once they get into the agreement, then, as Dr. Wolf was talking about, they have to begin to talk about sequencing, because one thing you have to be sure is that Iran this time is going to put a lot of emphasis on reciprocity and step-by-step procedure. In other words, Iran is not going to go back to before 2016, 2015, unless the U.S. makes similar steps. In other words, this time, I don't think Iranians are going to agree that, we're going to get rid of our centrifuges, or we're going to stop enriching uranium at 20%. And once we're done, then the U.S., for example, will remove some of the sanctions. I think this time it's going to be step by step. And for each step Iran makes, then the U.S. must make a step about removing the sanctions. And that's, I think, the most likely scenario, because this way, Iran and the U.S. are not directly negotiating, as is the position of Ayatollah Khamenei and many hardliners. And number two, it's going to restore confidence between Iran and the U.S., because, frankly, trust is, in my judgment, an extremely important principle in international relations and international law. Yes, you have to verify, trust and verify. But without trust, you don't even get to the point where you can verify. And unfortunately, in the past 2 or 3 years, the two countries have lost a little trust they had toward one another. So both countries, I hope, but especially the US, because after all, it was the US who got out of the nuclear deal. It wasn't Iran, and there is unanimous consensus within the JCPOA team that it was the US who got out. And therefore, I think it is very important for President Biden, future President Biden, to try to try to use American soft to restore a little bit of trust between the two countries. And once that trust is built, then I think a lot of things can take place between the two countries.
A question for Dr. Hendelman. My own. Israel and the states of the Abraham Accord, the UAE, have talked about their desire to play a bigger role in renegotiating, or not renegotiating the JCPOA, that's the wrong term, a bigger role in the United States rejoining the JCPOA in any talks. How does Israel imagine it can insert itself into the American policymaking process? And any ideas as well on how the UAE might be able to, and Saudi Arabia may be able to do that? And yeah.
Okay, so there are a couple of things here I would like to comment on. A few of the things that were mentioned earlier on about, for example, Turkey. And I would say that when it comes to the Qatar blockade, then we could have seen the mutual interest, perhaps of Erdogan and the Islamic Republic coming together in standing alongside Qatar. But we saw recently the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then we saw how Iran and Turkey at least opened up their own stance regarding that conflict, and they weren't aligned with each other on that border. So there are different interests here that are being played in the region, and it is very interesting for everyone who is interested in international relations and foreign policy to see how it will develop. So this is on that. I want to add something about Iran-China's relations, because here the relations are not symmetrical. For Iran, China is a lifeline, but China needs Iran less for its survival, and the real power conflict in the future will probably be between the US and China. So this will be very important to see how it develops, because there are many options that can occur in that. And of course, there is always Russia, that is also very important to this power struggle in the future. In terms of how the UAE, Israel, and the rest of the members of the Abraham Accords can influence the Biden administration, right now, as it seems, they are all joining hands in the same line or the same alliance or the same front, while confronting different challenges. It's not only, as you mentioned, Iran, there is also Turkey, there is also an ongoing civil war in Syria, there is a civil war in Yemen, and there are other conflicts that need to be resolved in this area. So it's not only the question of Iran alone. And I have to mention that when previous negotiations were being held in 2015, the bigger challenge in the area was ISIS. And this is probably some challenge that all sides rejoined hands and made efforts to resolve this challenge together. So again, there are many options that are opened, and I prefer, at least personally, to be more optimistic. And I believe that one of the differences between the many differences between Trump and Biden is that Biden is a very experienced politician. And Trump's attitude was a little bit different, both to international relations and to foreign policy. So I don't think we should just consider him, if this was the initial impression, that he will go right back to the Obama the Obama period and just erase the 4 years under Trump. I think it's more complicated than that.
Excellent there. And this raises another question, of course. There is one other formerly a major player in the region, which was Iraq, which has now been reduced to perhaps one of the greatest threats to stability should it again implode for any reasons in the way things are going in the region. Do Iranian interests in Iraq play any role in how they treat the JCPOA and working back into sort of the good graces of the United States, or not the good graces, but at least working back, removing this particular obstacle before them? Anyone? There. Hello?
Yeah,
Dr. Wolf, are you trying to get on?
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt anyone.
I'm fine, yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, I do think that they play a role. I mean, we're talking for the second time about closing our embassy in Baghdad. We're now doing the B-2 bomber flights again over Iran, and this includes Iraq. So I think that this plays a role, but at the same time, the Biden people have not discussed raising the troop levels again in Iraq. The Kurds have requested that we, the United States, put down troops to police the Kurdish-Syrian border again. So I think that it does play a role. I think that if Iraq implodes, and Ken Pollack was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, this will play a major role because, first of all, this is the Iranians see this as their sphere of influence. The second thing is that if they are somehow forced out of Iraq, I don't know if they're going to be in the same mood to make any sort of concessions or work on a JC or work to going back to the JCPOA or another version of the JCPOA that they might be in now. So that's my take on it. But that's what I think.
Dr. Milani, Dr. Hendelman.
I just like to make one point about your question, and it's more a conceptual point rather than a practical point. And the conceptual point is that for a long time, we had the tendency to look at Iran's regional policy as policies toward individual countries. For example, we will talk about Iran's policy toward Syria or toward Lebanon or Iraq. I think at least for the last, I would say, since the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, that kind of conceptual approach toward Iran's regional policy is misleading, it's not fruitful, and it really doesn't help us understand how Iran operates. There is a sort of organic connection among the major countries where Iran has established some military and political presence. In other words, we cannot simply talk about what we are going to do or what the US is going to do about Iran's activities in Iraq without understanding that whatever we do about Iran in Iraq is going to have a profound impact on what Iran is going to do in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, with Bashar al-Assad regime in Damascus, with the Houthis in Yemen, or even in Afghanistan. And remember, there are some estimates somewhere between, I've read different estimates and I don't know which one to believe, but somewhere between at least 25 to 50,000 militias, individual militiamen that are supported or guided by Iran, and they are spread out through the region. They're not just in one place. And for example, today, a lot of people are talking about the Fatimiyun, one of those groups that General Soleimani organized during this Syrian civil war, consisting mostly of the Hazaras in Afghanistan, the Shiites of Hazaras in Afghanistan, who were supposedly protecting the holy shrines in Damascus. There are some talks now that Iran might use them in Afghanistan. And as a matter of fact, officially, Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif has offered the Afghan government to send those trained militias to Afghanistan. So conceptually, I think it is important then to look at Iran's regional policies, and in that context, look at what Iran is doing individually in Syria or Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen or Afghanistan.
I would like to
Yes,
add
please,
that
please.
Iran is very much invested in Iraq for many years, longer period than what it has been invested in Syria or in other places. And they also share borders. And of course, there is the memory of the Iran-Iraq war. So I believe Iraq might be the last stronghold of Iran to pull out of, but this is an entire different topic.
If I may just add,
Please.
I completely agree with what I just heard about the importance of Iraq, because Iran has suffered greatest devastation, its greatest devastation in the past 500 years during the Iran-Iraq war. And Iran is going to go out of its way. I think it's the real ultimate red line for Iran to make sure that we are not going to see a similar hostile regime like Saddam Hussein in Iraq. It's much more important for Iran to have at least a neutral government, if not a Shiite pro-Iran government, at least a neutral government in Iraq. And they're they really are playing the long game. For example, right now, Iraq, I think, is either number 2 or number 3, but one of the top trade partners with Iran. The last time I checked was about a year and a half ago. The trade between the two countries exceeded $10 billion, which is quite a bit for both Iraq and Iran. And Iran does have a lot of historical, cultural influence in Iraq that goes back to hundreds of years. And today, as a result of these pro-Iranian militias, Iran has solidified its position in Iraq. So it's not going to be as simple as a lot of people think to force Iran out of Iraq.
Speaking of neighbors of Iran, excuse me, I have some Afghan friends who in the political sphere who believe that the course of way things are going, the what appears to them to be a determination by the United States under President Trump to depart Afghanistan no matter what, uh, terrifies Tehran. That this is going, that Tehran is terrified of the idea that American withdrawal from Afghanistan will be a significant security threat to Iran. Uh, do people agree that this is the case? And also, if so, how does that affect the Iranian view towards the JCPOA and future negotiations with the United States?
If I may, on this issue, a couple of things. I mean, obviously, Iran is very concerned about Afghanistan. They've been concerned about it for many years. However, it's important to remember that they almost went to war with the Taliban back in 1998 with some reason. I mean, they were provoked. However, they've now done almost a 180, and they've been almost in bed with the Taliban. It seems as though they want the United States out of Afghanistan, but they also seem to realize the troubles that are ahead. And so they're worried about, first of all, the potential for ISIS taking over. They're concerned about the prospect of a major refugee problem. And of course, they're worried about things such as the water issue, which has been a very significant issue for Iran for a long time. Remember, Rouhani in his first presidential campaign to fix the agriculture ministry. Water stealing is a major issue. So, when not only the United States leaves, but whatever is left to govern Afghanistan collapses, and to be frank, I think it will collapse. It's going to come down to Iran to, basically try and, keep something going in Afghanistan. But I don't think that they want the United States to stay. They want to put something else in its place. And Dr. Milani mentioned a moment ago, one of the potential forces that would be there to keep order. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that with respect to nuclear weapons, there's been speculation that the nuclear program at least received justification in part because the United States was on its border. It was on its border in Iraq, on its border in Afghanistan. Now, if the United States leaves both Afghanistan and Iraq, it's an open question as to whether or not it still has that justification to continue a nuclear program, or whether this puts a nudge in the direction of, and I'm using the term loosely, denuclearization. There's obviously still Pakistan on the border as well. So,
well, thank you very much. We are unfortunately running closer to time. I have a great deal more questions, both from myself and from the audience, but we won't be able to proceed and stay on track. If I could ask each of you to sort of sum up, where do you think this is? Where is this going in your case? Will Biden be able to pull off rejoining the JCPOA before the elections in Iran? And if not, what happens? Just in the same order, if you don't mind. Dr. Milani?
Yes, if you just allow me for 30 seconds to make a point about Dr. Wolf's very good material about Afghanistan. Again, it's a conceptual point, and everybody knows, but I don't think people pay enough attention to it. JCPOA was about one thing. It wasn't about two things. It wasn't about three. It wasn't about four. It was about one, and only one thing: Iran's nuclear program. In that agreement, JCPOA, it does say that the signatories hope that this could lead to more moderate policies by Iran. Hope is not an obligation. Hope is just hope. The point I'm trying to make is that we need to separate what Iran does regionally from the nuclear agreement. This is why President Obama correctly, rightly decided to address the nuclear issue first and then build upon this and go otherward. Now, as to your question, my hope is that the US goes back to JCPOA and does so quickly and does so without conditions, without any preconditions. Whether it's going to happen or not, I do not know, but that's definitely my hope. And I also believe if the US goes back to the nuclear agreement, to JCPOA, there is a good possibility that Iran can begin to review and revise some of its regional policies in consultation with, of course, other regional players. So I am cautiously optimistic, having for 4 years been unable to predict what the US does. I don't want to predict what the US is going to do in the next few years, but I am optimistically, I am cautiously optimistic because I believe President-elect Joe Biden is experienced, and his overall approach to the Middle East is not fundamentally different from the overall approach of President Barack Obama.
Thank you. Dr. Hendelman, you may have competition for the most optimistic person in this conference.
Okay.
So
So I said from the beginning that it's a very narrow window of opportunities. It's 6 months, but within the framework of confidence building measures that we've mentioned also. So I believe that in this small and narrow window of opportunities, there might be certain steps that can be taken and later on developed. And in this case, it might be in the form of authorizing loans to Iran from the International Monetary Fund or allowance of European credit lines to Iran. These can be like small measures of good faith and start to again build and renew the confidence between the two countries.
Dr. Wolf.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and this has been a great panel. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that the President-elect Biden it really does know what he's doing. I do think that there is a very narrow window. If we think about it, it's actually a little less than 6 months, and it does depend not just who's in office in the U.S. It also depends upon who's going to get elected in Iran. And a concern I have is, who does the Council of Guardians allow to run? And also what kind of a mandate do they get? So, but I think that if there are, as Dr. Hendelman just said, a series of confidence building measures, and if we, the United States, we actually move first, or even make 2 moves, and we do this correctly, then I think we will be able to restore the JCPOA. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Well, thank you all. On behalf of the Gulf International Forum, my only regrets on this particular seminar is that we indeed had a time limit. I think there were so many more issues we could have explored. The question of Iranian human rights, how these will be treated in the United States, the larger, pending catastrophes in the larger region. Russia, we did not discuss very much, but nonetheless, this is a fascinating discussion, and I hope that it provokes a lot of our audience to talk and think about this more in the future. Thank you so much. It was again a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.